All right, everyone. In this video, we're going to go a little bit over how to build a macrocycle. Some of you I know have asking about how we build each specific week, but I figure we start from the beginning and go over a full macrocycle, and then we'll break it down into each parts. So a good way to do it is to go backwards from where your competition is. So I just threw some weeks up here, starting from this week, just going down to where it fits on my board. So for example, let's say if April 1st, that's our meet week. Okay, so let's say your meet is on April 7th, then you would just work backwards from here all the way up to build your macrocycle. So for a macrocycle for powerlifting would basically be your full training cycle into a competition. And then the one below that would be your mesocycle, which would be each specific phase that you're doing, whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever. And then a microcycle, the smallest would be each specific week. So we'll eventually get to that, going over each specific week and how we decide on which days to do our training sessions. So for example, like I said, our meet is April 7th, so this is our meet week. So what I like to always do is just write in there, I actually write in there meet week, just to remind myself that that is the actual week that you guys are competing in, to build the training based on what the meet week training should be, to know that I might have to email you guys a water cut protocol, I might have to send you guys warm-ups and attempts. So I just put that in there. But really, it's a taper week is what you can call it, because you're tapering down your volume and possibly your intensity because you are competing on that Saturday. Okay, so then we're going to work backwards from there. And usually people are going to need another taper week. So this is where it depends on the person. But usually people need another taper week just because this 1 week is not enough. So if you go a high volume on this Friday or Saturday, then you might not be fully recovered by this Saturday. And also sometimes we do have meets that fall on a Friday, or even if like with Raw Nationals these days, you might be competing on a Wednesday on this week. So it helps to have that extra taper week in there where you step down the volume a little bit here, then step down the volume a lot over here. Then it comes the actual peak, and the peak's going to depend on the person. Usually if you have a higher max, or you're a heavier lifter, or you're a stronger lifter, Wilks or whatever you want to use, then you're going to need a bigger peak, more weeks. If you are a weaker lifter, lower Wilks, a lighter lifter, if you're not water cutting or weight cutting at all, then you probably don't need as much. But typically people fall around somewhere around 3 to 5 weeks. And for most of you, we do about 4 weeks, because that really lets us build up our intensity through those 4 weeks, and we can even maintain the intensity or increase a little bit on the taper week. So you might actually build up here from 80% range here, and then here maybe 90% range with these 2 weeks. And then depending on how this week goes, maybe bump up the intensity even a little further for this one while you're dropping off the volume. Or if you basically hit what would be like a second attempt or a max attempt here, then we would drop the intensity here and drop the intensity here. But about 4 weeks is kind of what people fall into, which also works well because a lot of people build their training off of 4 weeks or monthly blocks. So you'd get this 4 week peak block. And then what I like to call before that is basically just a strength block, basically just general strength. So that might be 4 weeks as well. And people might term it differently. They might call it intensity block, base block, whatever they want to do. I just use whatever words or descriptions in your guys' schedule that will remind me, since I'm the one who's looking at it, what the purpose of those blocks is, what that block is. So for example, for the peak block, usually in the description, I write something about increasing the intensity, lowering the volume, being more competition specific with your lifts. Whereas with the strength block, you might be maintaining volume, increasing intensity, and still having some variations in there, closer variations, pause squats, pin squats, that kind of stuff. And then before that, I usually throw in the volume block. So some people call it something different, but I call it a volume block to remind myself the purpose of that is the volume, not necessarily the intensity, not necessarily a specific rep PR for a single set. So for the volume block, it's about increasing the volume, regardless of what the intensity is at, more variations and also farther variations. That's where you guys do a lot of dumbbell shoulder press, lat pull down, biceps, triceps, dips, Bulgarian split squats, all that kind of stuff. Good mornings, just like the general strength and hypertrophy exercises. So this is what maybe a 2 week volume block, 4 week strength block, 4 week peak block, and then a 2 week taper looks like. If I actually had more space, I'd build it out, and you can actually have a 4 week volume block. So then you have a 4 week strength block, a 4 week peak block, which is like the standard 3 blocks people use to go into a competition, and then you just taper down your volume, intensity, and compete. Also, what I do for a lot of you guys, especially after a competition or newer lifters, I do an intro week. So just a 1 week intro to get used to the new kind of training. So this is what it kind of looks like. As I mentioned, working backwards from the day of your meet or from the week of your meet, working backwards and figuring out what you need in there as far as how many weeks need to peak. And you can actually do specific numbers. For example, if you like 10-pound jumps, then you can figure out, okay, well, if in the meet I want to hit 300, then maybe I need to hit 290 here. Then maybe I need to hit 280 here. I need to hit 270 here. And I need to hit 260 here. And then you can figure out, well, if I'm only at 200 during my strength block, well, then it's probably too big of a jump, and maybe you need a 5th week to peak or a 6th week to peak so you can build up closer based on what kind of jumps you like. But if you're already here, let's say in your strength block, you're already working at 245, then you're comfortable with that jump, and maybe you only need 4 weeks to peak because you can handle these 15-pound and then 10-pound jumps and then taper and then hit your 300 PR in your competition. Also, depending on what kind of training you're doing, we tend to be more conservative. We don't do a lot of AMRAPs. We don't do a lot of maxing out. We don't go to failure too much. We don't miss reps. So we usually don't need a deload in here anywhere. But if you are doing lots of AMRAPs, if you are missing reps, if you are doing a ton of volume on the accessory work, then possibly after your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, you might need a deload in here. So if I erase this right here, then you might put a planned deload in here, knowing that you're going to push yourself really hard during these 5 weeks and you're going to create a lot of fatigue. And so you do a planned deload to drop down that fatigue so that then you can push these rest of these weeks, these 5 weeks into the competition. Because if you try and push yourself really hard through an entire 10 weeks, then you might start feeling bad around week 8 or maybe week 9 and then going backwards, or maybe hurting yourself, or maybe missing your 90% plus singles, and then you won't have a good meet. So if depending on how you train, you got to put that planned deload in. But for us, we usually don't go that crazy. So I mean, usually it's the opposite. You guys are always complaining to me that it's too easy and that you can do more weight, but the whole thing is just building over the entire cycle. So it also gives us more weeks to train. So if you're taking a planned deload or two every single training cycle, then you're missing out on a couple months of training every year. Whereas this way, take a more conservative approach, you're able to train more often and get more volume in, do more accessory work, that kind of stuff, by not having the deload in there. Okay, and then always this thing can change. So while you're doing your actual training, if for some reason you do have to take a deload, you should always be ready to change it if you need to. So there are some times where we always just change the week on the spot based on the updates you guys tell me, and maybe we do a half a week deload or a full week deload in there, even though it wasn't planned, just because maybe stress levels were unexpected from here, from work or school, or just the training was harder than we thought. Maybe you overshot an RPE or something like that, and so we have to just switch it up on the spot, which sometimes you do have to do. Even though this is a structured plan, the structure does have to sometimes change. Hopefully this kind of helps you guys see what a macro cycle looks like for powerlifting, and then we can do videos later on going into each mesocycle. So for example, this would be a strength mesocycle, and then as I said, each individual week will be a microcycle. So we'll go into those next.